good afternoon or good morning, maybe, depending on where you are, or maybe good evening. So welcome to our session, which is CitieS-Health, Citizen Science through Postnormal Science Lenses, Challenges and Lessons from the CitieS-Health project. I am Bruna de Marchi, and I'm affiliated researcher at the Center for Wetenschap Theory at the University of Bergen, Norway, and I also collaborate with the social enterprise Epidemiology e Prevenzione. Now, the organization of the session is as follows. We will have 4 speakers, and I would like them to introduce themselves briefly. Now you see 3 speakers because the 4th one is not yet there, but can you please introduce yourself in the order in which you will speak? So Muki, please.
Hello, I'm Muki Haklay. I'm at University College London and also co-directing the Extreme Citizen Science Group.
Thank you. And then Gerard.
Yes, I'm Gerard Hoek. I'm environmental epidemiologist working at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And now I'm also heavily involved in citizen science since a long time. Especially in practical implementation of citizen science in environmental epidemiology.
Okay, then we have David.
Yes, hello. Great to be here. David Kriebel from the United States, University of Massachusetts over near Boston on the East Coast. I am an epidemiologist also, occupational and environmental epidemiologist, and I work in an organization called the Center for Sustainable Production. We do a lot of work with industries, with unions, with citizens groups, and so very interested in precaution and citizen science. Happy to be with you today.
Okay, the 4th speaker should be Annibale Biggeri, that probably believes that the symposium takes place in Florence, because I know he's there, but maybe he didn't realize that it's online instead. Anyway, Annibale Biggeri is professor of medical statistics in the University of Florence, and he's also the president of social enterprise Epidemiology e Prevenzione. And is involved in several projects on the health and environmental effects of pollution from different sources, very often in collaboration with local communities and interested citizens. Now, as I said, he should have been our host in Florence. So now I think that given the current circumstances, we are all grateful to those who made this event possible. And so the organization of the session is as follows. There will be 3 presentations in the order which I announced, and these 3 presentations will be on video, provided that the videos will work. We trust that. Then the 4th presentation by Annibale Biggeri will be live. So you have the instruction on how to ask questions and so on. So I think we can start with the first presentation by Muki. Thank you very much to everyone. Of course, at the end of the presentation, there will be questions and answers, but you can start asking questions using the chat.
Thank you for the invitation to come and talk to you today. We'll start with our synopsis. What I am going to cover is to look at different typologies of citizen science. We'll first look at what kind of activities included in what we today call citizen science. Then we'll look at the goals and activities type typology, and finally 2 typologies that help us in understanding the relationship between scientists and participants. Our first typology is looking at what type of activities are included in what we call citizen science. We have the long-running citizen science activities that sometimes run for over 150 years, with people participating in weather observation or ecological observation. We have citizen cyberscience, which rely on internet and computing in order to operate, and community science, which is all about bottom-up activities which community are leading by themselves. So let's look at some examples. of what type of activities fall into this area. So the Community Collaborative Rail, Hail and Snow Network, or COCORAS, has started in 1998 and engaged people in recording precipitation around their area. This information is then provided at a larger scale, and you can see on the map how many points there are, and it already helps in early warning of floods. In cities and cyber science, we can look at tasks like this one, volunteer computing, where people download a software that allows scientists to use their computing devices in order to calculate an activity that involves nanotubes and filtering water. In community science, there are activities like participatory sensing. This is an example from the Every Aware project, where a software that allows people to record the level of noise that they are exposed to, allow them also to decide when and where to collect it, and that was carried out around Heathrow. Also within community sciences, do-it-yourself science, examples are now available of open hardware like this one, a sensor for humidity and temperature that can be done very easily and allow people to create devices that suits exactly their needs. Now that we've seen the activities, we can take the different zones that we are familiar with from postnormal science, the applied, the professional consultancy, and the postnormal science area, and consider how the activities fits within this framework. Our first example will be volunteer computing. So here's a current example where your phone can support science that will analyze different issues around coronavirus. You download it, it's black box, it's very applied from both the participant level, but also from the scientist. It is a computing environment like others. Passive sensing involves people providing a sensor that streams data, like this example of a weather station that is then can be linked to the IBM weather underground system. In passive sensing, people are providing information that while weather information is uncertain, the fact of observation and the data collection is very well established. Volunteer thinking get us into the area of professional consultancy or the normal science, where we can see people that contribute through cognitive efforts. So in this case, they are helping scientists to analyze health records, and there are many projects of this sort within the Zooniverse platform. Ecological observations are another example of participation which give us higher uncertainty, which is why we need all these observations. And there is a whole discussion within ecology around data quality and the modeling based on participants. But it's still within the mainstream ecological research. As we noted, participatory sensing can involve different ways where participants already decide where and what to sense. So odor collect is an example of using the human ability to smell in order to record different incidents and share information about the environment. There can be a situation where this is used with a polluting factory, and therefore the stakes can be higher. DIY science also provide us with an example of the postnormal science, because now people are setting up their own system in their own configuration. And in this case of a flood network, there is an issue about how this information interfaces and used with official information. So far with that type of situation where stakes are high, we haven't seen good and full integration between environmental authorities and participants. Community science or civic science deal with contentious issues like this example from the development of high-speed rail link 2 in the UK, where the community is concerned with air quality. Here, people are using diffusion tubes, a simple device for measuring air quality, in order to have a baseline. The stakes are clearly high and the facts are clearly uncertain. Finally, we can think about the quantified self, where people say measuring their own performance with devices like this one or Fitbit. And here the uncertainty about the personal situation can be high, but the decisions they are limited with the fact that a lot of time it's about the individuals. There are cases that divert from that, but generally speaking, that is the case. Our next typology looks at primary goal and the physical environment in which the project is happening. So this one is from Wiggins and Croston, and it describes the following options. They describe project as action-oriented, where they are trying to make an issue or deal with local issue. Conservation project, which are mostly about natural resource management. Investigation project that are trying to achieve a research goal and requiring some data collection. Virtual project, and here it is important to note that in this classification, virtual volunteer computing is excluded. An education project where the main goal is education and outreach. We will position the investigation project at the applied science because the participants are required to collect data, usually under very strict standards, to act as an instrument. There are cases where it can be argued that it belongs to the middle tier, and you should think about it in that way. Education, on the other hand, is very clearly something that is well structured and clearly within the applied. The virtual project belong to the area of normal science because they are operating as a way to contribute data in forms like our volunteer thinking. Conservation is gaining uncertainty and importance and getting further towards the post-normal science because the decision stakes in natural resource management are higher. But it is the action-oriented project in this classification that clearly go into the post-normal. The next classification is called for short the 5C classification. It came out from work by Bonnie in 2009 and then Shirk expanded it in 2012. It talks about 5 types of project. Contractual, where communities hire professionals to carry out research for them. A contributory project where scientists design a project and ask people to participate in it, contribute data, or do some work. Collaborative project where the scientists are in lead, but there is an opportunity to refine the question and improve it. Co-created project, which are created together from the start, and collegial project where the public is creating their own project and not always expecting recognition from institutional science. So again, if we position them within our different zones, contractual is clearly applied because the scientists are carrying out the work in a contractual form. There will be sometimes when it's a bit more open, but it belongs to that area, maybe slightly a bit higher. The contributory project belongs to the heart of normal science, and that's the most common types of citizen science. The collaborative is interesting because it lives at the boundary. It starts with scientists doing their own thing, but then opening it up to the public. The co-created will live somewhere in the area of the post-normal. And finally, the collegial is clearly an example where it's bottom-up It's creating new opportunity, and it's starting to ask different questions about science. Also because communities will ask questions when it's critical for them. Finally, my classification from 2013, which point to different levels. So crowdsourcing, when it's mostly operating the sensors, distributed intelligence, where we use the skills of the participant either through ecological observation or through a interpretation with a computer. Participatory science, where there is an involvement in problem definition and data collection, but analysis carried out by the scientist. And the extreme citizen science, where the whole process is happening with the community, maybe with support of scientists. So again, we will see in these zones that crowdsourcing is in the applied area, the distributed intelligence, just like the contributory, and the other example is somewhere within the professional consultancy or the normal science. The participatory science, it's somewhat similar to the collaborative, although it's raising the stakes somewhat. And the extreme citizen science, well within the post-normal, because also a lot of time it will happen when communities are coming with a need that require urgent handling. So let's have a few observations. First of all, the classifications that allow themselves along the diagonal of post-normal science between low uncertainty and stakes too high. A lot of citizen science activity are within the realm of the normal science and the applied, and that's a lot of it is because of it. It's the project owner find it easier to handle it this way. Also, we point that within this area, citizen science is providing democratization in the sense of who is allowed to do science and very limited degree of how to do the science. So there is no challenges to the ontology and the methodology of how things are being done. The next thing that we can point about the activities that fall within post-normal science is that there are activities of this side that are usually small scale. They attracted a lot of interest, and there is literature on them, especially in the science and technology studies, but they don't get the support or the openness that will make them grow and become more active. So what post-normal science analysis allows us is both to notice where they are, but also to notice on the potential directions where things can go. So thank you for listening, and I hope that this overview of citizen science and its position within post-normal science was relevant and not too confusing.
Thank you very much, Muki. Very interesting presentation, very fit for purpose, given that we are in the PNS symposium. And so in synthesis, we will have 2 more videos and 1 live presentation before we can hopefully open the discussion and have some time left for question and answer. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you for inviting me to give this presentation to you. I'd rather have given this presentation live in Florence rather than here in Utrecht, but I suppose this is second best. I'm giving this presentation also on behalf of Fleur Voeling, who is a PhD student working on the CitieS-Health project. In this presentation, I will start with giving a little bit of background on application of citizen science to environmental health issues. Then, using a well-known framework, talk about characterization of uncertainty, and then go into empirical discussions on uncertainty in exposure assessment, focusing on citizen science studies. And then I will end with showing a couple of slides on the CitieS-Health approach as it's being applied to wood smoke and health. Citizen science is applied increasingly in environmental issues, particularly by measuring environmental stresses such as air pollution and noise. And
This application takes place primarily because of local concerns by citizens, and not so much about because of curiosity to learn something. So the people are really concerned about the air, water, or soil pollution in their neighborhood, and often related to local sources, such as wood burning by their neighbors, or a base station emitting electromagnetic fields on top of the building that you're living in. And people are then concerned with possible health effects. So this presentation will deal with primarily local environmental issues in mind, and not so much the global issues like climate change. In this slide, I would like to show you a couple of examples of application of citizen science and exposure assessment. To make sure we're talking about the same thing, exposure assessment is characterized as the process to establish how high the exposure of people is to environmental stresses such as air pollution and noise. And exposure is not necessarily linked to also empirical studies of the health effects related to these exposures. Below are a number of examples. CitieSHealth is a project developed in the city of Antwerp in Belgium around a large infrastructural work where a large number of citizens make measurements of air pollution. A Dutch NGO has stimulated citizens to make measurements by themselves of nitrogen dioxide, an important traffic-related air pollutant, using passive samplers. And the Measuring Together platform of the Dutch National Institute of Environment and Public Health makes it possible for citizens to make measurements with low-cost sensors, which they can obtain from RIVM, and where the data are being displayed in it. Characterization of uncertainty, and for that I have looked back at the NUSAP approach. Here are two references that I looked at. And one of the items here is that most of the present day methodologies for addressing uncertainty mostly focus on quantitative uncertainty, either in input data or model parameters, whereas there are also other sources of uncertainty. These methods are less developed than the simple quantitative characterization methods. And these are four domains characterize uncertainty: technical, for example, measurement of a pollutant; methodological, certain theories; epistemological concerns; and societal uncertainties. And the more we go down, the more fundamental these uncertainties are in understanding the system in which the policy issue takes place. The first topic to discuss is about the quality of low-cost sensors. Low-cost sensors are often used in the citizen science project. This refers to the measurement, so a technical source of uncertainty. Sensors of particles in air often detect not only the particles but also respond to humidity, and sensors moreover are prone to drift, so they may not measure the same quantity today as in a month's time. So this is a serious issue. What has been counteracted to that is that if applied in large numbers, they can be very powerful even when the quality is lower, because they compensate for the fact that they are being used in large numbers. An issue related to that is comparability with legal limit values. Very often people would like to compare their measured value with a legal limit value and then ask for a policy response. That's a difficult issue. Partly because the local sensors don't fulfill the requirements that the regulatory monitors apply. And it's not only about the instrument, but it's often also that the sampling frequency and the location of the measurements do not necessarily comply with regulations. I would stimulate people to stay away as much as possible from regulatory discussions and link the measured result as much as possible to direct health effects. Because entering in this regulatory debate is killing every This illustrates the point what I wanted to make about staying away from the regulatory debate and focusing on health effects. This is a graph taken from a large cohort study, epidemiological study, with on the x-axis the concentration of PM2.5 fine particles in air, and on the y-axis the relative risk of dying related to pollution. And as you see, there is a fairly continuous relationship with, and for the health of the population, it actually doesn't matter too much whether you're just below or just above the limit value. So it's more important to link it to health. Another topic then, there's a general lack of trust in models, especially if they are governmental. Here are a number of examples: noise calculations around Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands, nitrogen deposition of agricultural emissions, calculation of traffic-rated air pollution in cities. Now, sometimes this lack of trust is very well founded because the government actually pushes organizations to make choices to reach the desired result, but quite often this is actually not really well founded criticism. And there are quite a few cases where monitoring is actually not better than modeling. And I would hold that experts should not be afraid to declare that models could actually be better than particularly low-cost monitoring. It is important that the transparency around these models is improved. And this debate also links to what is called the post-truth area. So some farmers have stated that ammonia in the Netherlands only has vertical dispersion and no horizontal dispersion. Third topic around uncertainty, and that is that bias may actually be introduced by citizens if they perform a citizen science project. That may apply especially if a study involves subjective reporting of both exposure and health outcomes. So, for example, nuisance, some symptoms related to the outcome. And this is a phenomena actually which is well addressed in environmental epidemiology. It's not particular to a citizen science project. Another issue about uncertainty, added uncertainty from citizen science project is claimed low quality of measurements because experts have not been involved in this. Now, there are two obvious ways of addressing this potential problem, and that is particularly by doing a very careful quality assurance, and probably it would be in good practice to link with experts who can advise citizens. With the caveat that this should not kill creativity, and we should not engage in theoretical discussions about the way to do measurements. The issues I so far addressed are primarily technical, methodological issues, but nevertheless important. I list here a couple of issues that have to do with the actual definition of the issue. It goes further into the methodological, epistemological uncertainty. So one nice example is that airport air pollution emissions have never been considered very problematic for the local environment. That was because the assessment was based on regulated pollutants. And at some point, someone started measuring ultrafine particles, which are also health relevant but are not regulated. And then suddenly the airport turned to be an enormously important source of air pollution, also for the local environment. And another point of the definition of the issue is that if we want to address citizens' concern in a local area, then we need to address the type of exposure that people are concerned with. For example, whether people are concerned with short-term peaks in exposure or with long-term average exposure, that are living in places that are always highly exposed. The other example of a citizen concern could be the population that people are primarily exposed in. Could be children, elderly, or everyone. Now, suppose we have established exposure, then we come to a next question, and that is, what's the implication for health of the established exposure? How bad is it if we have a certain number? And there are various ways to look at that. I listed those here. I made a comment below saying that experts should not be too afraid to provide the best judgment even without incomplete information. And then the final point is whether a new research study is needed at all in a local policy issue, given what we already know from the issue at stake. And another question, is new research actually leading to a better answer than just using the existing information? What if a study that we do on exposure and health does not show an association between exposure and health? Should we then say, okay, let the situation exist? And one of them is that probably local citizens may be the best judge, depending on how they appreciate pitfall. We have applied this framework in the Netherlands to a study of wood burning and health. In the identification phase, we had an online call for questions in which 130 questions were asked by about 90 citizens. And the first question that we actually had to deal with when debating with the citizens was, is there actually new research needed? Can we answer questions with existing research? Questions that we received from citizens can be placed in three categories: health, physical, and mental, including nuisance, exposure, how high are levels, and we then discussed the design of the health effects study by offering three broad designs to the citizens, particularly short-term exposure health effect, long-term exposure health effect, and studies on stress. And we got, after the online meeting, got feedback from citizens by email. And a month later, we discussed the exact design, including the protocol, diaries, etc., addressing uncertainties and also data. So finally, Citizen Science Project addressed some of the fundamental uncertainties, particularly with respect to issue framing, epistemological and societal. If not carefully addressed, that may go at the expense of technical and methodological uncertainties. So I think for Citizen Science Project to be successful, careful quality assurance is needed on all levels.
So now we will have the third presentation by David Kriebel. Just a few seconds that Angela will be able to show the video. And if you already want to start asking questions through the chat, we can collect the question and have the discussion afterwards. So there will be David Kriebel now.
I'm David Kriebel. I am a professor at the University of Massachusetts in the United States, and I'm happy to be with you. I want to really first thank the organizers of this meeting, particularly Bruna de Marchi and Annibale Biggeri, and all of the others made this possible. I hope I'm able to make a useful contribution for you today. And I also want to just note that I'm so sorry we're not all together in person in Florence, and I hope that can happen soon. My work is as an epidemiologist, developing evidence on the hazards of technologies and chemicals, the effects on things like cancer. And as such, I have been involved in talking with, communicating these findings to the public, citizen scientists, policymakers, and I've been asked to think about and talk about the role of precaution in that work. So, is the idea of precaution useful in this post-normal science world in which I work, in which environmental health evidence is developed, debated, used or not used. And so first to set the context for that, just to remind you, this is the original beginning kind of the precautionary principle in environmental health, something called the Rio Declaration, 1992, where there is threat of serious or irreversible damage. A lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing measures preventing environmental degradation. This has been both cited frequently as an important milestone, but also it's been pointed out that it's a rather confusing statement. It has in it a triple negative. It's essentially saying not having evidence about a risk, not a reason for not acting preventively. Somewhat problematic to understand and turn into action. Its origin is generally accepted to be this German word, German concept for Sorgeprinzip. And I think if I had been asked 30 years ago, I might have proposed a different translation into English, maybe something like foresight principle rather than precaution. But precaution is what we have. A few years later, in '98, a bunch of activists met in the United States and proposed a somewhat clearer statement, definition. When an activity raises threats of harm to the environment or human health, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. They, at Wingspread, laid out these four components. The first one really is the core, is that same idea, taking preventive action in the face of uncertainty. But then they added three additional considerations or factors that one ought to shift the burden of proof to proponents of an activity, that one ought to explore a wide range of alternatives before taking a potentially harmful action, and that it was important to increase public participation in decision making. So, precautionary principle is intended to provide guidance in the kind of gray area between what's clearly safe and what's clearly hazardous. But I think it has been criticized, and I would say often appropriately, for being vague. When is the principle invoked, and which actions are appropriate to invoke precaution for? It's easy to criticize. Is shoot first and ask questions later an example of using the precautionary principle? Well, hopefully not, but it seems at first blush to fit that idea. Is it simply just the idea of better safe than sorry? Well, despite these challenges, I do think that it can be useful as a framing device for discussions with the public in the citizen scientist context, for example. Framing the question, the really deep and always an important question of how much evidence is enough before we take some particular action. And related is what I have observed another challenge in talking with the public about this question, how much evidence, is the myth of certainty. I think that citizens and policymakers continue to believe, we could say to hope, that certainty is possible. And while people, as long as people hold out hope for certainty, it's very difficult to get them to acknowledge that we have to act in the absence of that certainty, in the face of uncertainty. So I think that in order to move towards accepting precautionary action, the public must become more comfortable that certainty is not attainable. And I'll get to this in a moment, but I actually think that this is in some way a small benefit of this terrible pandemic that we find ourselves in, because the public are seeing in very real time that we are being asked to do things that we understand. The evidence is not entirely clear for because this virus is so new and so much is not known about it. I think that scientists have a responsibility, have a role to play in weakening this myth of certainty. I think we can do more to emphasize how little is known about many health and environmental hazards. And when we are more humble and acknowledging of uncertainties, I think there are a couple of benefits of that. One is a simple one, that if we say that there's a lot we don't know, it makes it easier to argue that more money is needed, more funding is needed to support research. But a little bit more practically, it also, this humility removes a major support under this myth that science can give clear and certain answers as long as we just study it enough. Then there's a related misunderstanding that I have observed in my work with the public and citizen scientists. A related misunderstanding about how science gets to proof or to truth or to cause. It's often thought, I think, maybe implicitly, that knowledge just accumulates until a certain threshold is reached. And at that point, the risk is understood to be real or true. And of course, in the postnormal science world, we understand that this is not really the way it works. That instead, knowledge accumulates. There is no threshold. Different amounts of evidence justify different responses. Sometimes all we can say is, just need to study this more. There's nothing we can do. And the use of some technology, for example, continues. Sometimes we can say there's enough evidence of harm here that we ought to limit this technology, not ban it outright, not close it off completely, but perhaps limit it. And then sometimes we do, in fact, say there's enough hazard here, enough evidence of hazard here that we should stop using some technology. Under this second model, as postnormal science scholars and activists like yourselves know very well, under this second model, the process really cannot be entirely conducted within the scientific community. The public, regulators, law courts, judges are necessarily involved. And so we scientists need to speak to this broader audience and lay out, explain assumptions, choices of methods, all of which have implications for how much evidence these findings actually represent. So when do we know enough to act in this basic deep question? Determination of sufficient evidence for action depends on context. It depends on things like the availability of alternative ways of achieving the same social good. It depends on the consequences of inaction or of acting in error. So I think that despite its vagueness, the precautionary principle can sometimes be useful as a way to focus attention on this deep question, when do we know enough to act? And a useful thing that I have seen is that it focuses attention on the fact that the status quo is not precautionary very often. So we've named this status quo as the reactionary principle, following the reactionary principle. And this is simply standing the precautionary principle on its head. These are the four precautionary principle concepts rewritten and see if they don't sound like the way we do things very often right now in our society. We require incontrovertible evidence of harm before taking preventive action. We place the burden on the public to show that each new technology is harmful. We don't consider the health or impacts of a new technology. Put it out into the environment. And we discourage public participation in decision making. So when I have found that citizen scientists presented with this caution versus reaction contrast are quite moved and quite energized, it makes it much clearer what precaution means by seeing what it's not, sort of aha moment. I think that, as I mentioned before, the pandemic is also an opportunity in an ironic way to advance the public's understanding of the limits of science and of the need for precautionary action. Here's an article from a British magazine, The New Statesman, in April of this year, how coronavirus has led to the return of precautionary principle. The pandemic is showing the value of caution as a guiding influence in government. There it is. This also from April. I was amazed to find online this article written by the Royal Society of Chemistry. Okay, not a body that I would normally think to look to for discussion of precaution, but here they are, applying the precautionary principle when the science is uncertain. And the Royal Society of Chemistry is taking lessons from the pandemic and saying, here are some lessons we have learned watching the unfolding of the pandemic and the scientific evidence for action to prevent the spread of the virus. We've learned some lessons about effective science policy. It should be transparent, particularly about the limitations, the evidence. We should recognize that science is just one factor alongside social, economic, and ethical considerations. We need to be open to change. Very open-minded, very progressive lessons, and I very much agree, of course, that these are cautionary lessons. So I think that COVID-19 has made precaution an immediately relevant concept for the public. You know, we're being told, for example, to use safety practices like wearing a mask, social distancing, which are based on very limited evidence. And the public can see this. Is a face cloth effective at slowing the epidemic? Okay, we have to social distance, but is 1 meter enough? How about a half a meter? These are really important questions that we are dealing with every day in our lives. And the evidence is really not very strong. For example, for cloth face masks, the evidence that they reduce the spread of the virus is really very limited. But I think that they can be justified, they are justified by precautionary principle. And admitting that the science is limited can reduce the risk of politicization when contradictory evidence emerges. If policymakers were humble and transparent in making recommendations about things like face coverings and say, we're appealing to the precautionary principle, I think it makes it harder then for that science to become politicized when we learn later that the evidence perhaps is not as strong as initially thought. So I think that COVID-19 has made precaution immediately relevant. And I wish that the public health authorities were listening to the Royal Society of Chemistry and invoking that principle. So looking ahead to the future, I think citizen science projects, the public will use the lessons of COVID-19 to form their views of the proper role of science and of precaution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Well, I think if we just forget some technological accidents, I think we had the 3 very good and interesting presentations. So I really thank all 3 presenters. And of course, one of the key words is certainty or uncertainty or lack of certainty. And just a small comment that, of course, if we are so very far from certainty, and we should not even aspire to certainty, I think we are very far also from humility, to which instead we might aspire and try to become more, respectful and what's the humility? Humile? Well, I think it's humile. Okay. Anyway, the next speaker will be Annibale Biggeri, whom I already introduced. So now I think he will go in streaming as well. Thank you, everyone.
This is a digital presentation for the PNS Digital Journal on Monday, 21st of September. I will present a joint work with Bruna de Marchi and other colleagues based on the experience of a European Union Horizon 2020 CitieS-Health project running on the years 2019 and 2021. The CitieS-Health project is a citizen science for urban environment and health, involves partners from 5 European countries and consists of 5 pilot studies: Barcelona and Spain and Lucca in Italy on air pollution and health, Amsterdam on wood burning and health, Ljubljana in Slovenia on urban noise and health, and Kaunas in Lithuania on city design and health. All the 5 pilot studies represent several kinds of citizen science initiatives in the field of environmental epidemiology. For example, pilots led by institutions and pilots in which citizen groups engage researchers. My talk will address 4 points, illustrated by the Italian pilot study within the CitieS-Health project. The complexity of every citizen science initiative is the first point. It's well known that citizen science embraces a heterogeneous set of study design, activities, projects, and so on. This heterogeneity is present also within a single citizen science initiative, together with some heterogeneity of ends. Second point is the transdisciplinary characteristics of citizen science initiatives framed in a PNS analysis. The extended peer community forces a continuous mutual redefinition of roles and expertise. The third point is the participatory approach in environmental epidemiology. Due to the longer tradition of citizen science in environmental fields, setting up participatory study design is a hot topic, particularly when claimed pollution episodes are to be considered. The last point, which cannot be ignored, is the changing landscape of the epidemiologic initiative due to the COVID-19 pandemics. Our Italian pilot includes some traditional citizen science activities, like those aimed to measure air pollutant concentrations. The pilot came from pre-existing citizen science projects, Che Aria Tira, sponsored by a citizen committee, Mamme No Inceneritore, covering several Italian regions, as shown in the picture to the left. Do-it-yourself particle sensors, owned by single citizens, are connected in a national network. The local committee and private citizens in the area covered by the pilot developed their own monitoring network and joined the large national citizen science network. At the same time, they are part of a CitieS-Health pilot. Within the pilot, scientists focused on heavy metal pollution from a copper foundry active since 1916. Citizens were engaged in planning the future of their community. In the picture, a recent public manifestation in support of the participatory process, as regulated by a Tuscany regional law, about the deliberation of a new energy plant to be built by the copper foundry. Scientists were interested in the history of the industrialization of the areas. Citizens were calling for social accountability and responsibility of the industry. The 1916 born industry was a classic example of philanthropic capitalism. The village of Fornaci was founded as residence of the workers. Houses, the church, schools were built by the industry. The industry employed a large female workforce, leading to a growing autonomy and emancipation of women in a previously poor and rural territory. The extended peer community was active since the beginning of the pilot, mainly due to long-standing interaction between one of us and the citizens of the other. The epidemiology design was continuously discussed, and the study objective, methods, data gathering, and study conduct were co-defined with scientists. The primary objective was to measure prevalence of chronic kidney disease. Design evolves in the idea of storing blood sample for future use, eventually measuring other biological and politically relevant endpoints. How to maintain property of biologic materials stored in a biobank is an open question. One option we discussed is to set up something similar to a biotrust in the definition of Vinikoff and Vinikoff. We call that biolibrary. The Citizen Science Initiative evolves in previously unintended way, and participated data management and governance is currently under discussion. The extended peer community is the place where trust is continuously regenerated. It is not guaranteed, but needs to be sustained, and threats need to be identified. In this process, we set up a series of public events aimed to anticipate all potential outcomes of the epidemiological investigation. What will I be? The answer may not be as comforting as in Doris Day's and in Hitchcock's movie. Answering uncomfortably, like epidemiologic result will be inconclusive, or catastrophically, like there will be a large disease burden, should be considered. Prospecting scenarios addresses the uncertainty in every epidemiologic investigation. The debate is, however, not limited to citizens and scientists. Local institutions, city mayors, are required to express their intentions at the face of each distinct scenario, a crucial step in which any hidden agenda may be uncovered. There is no time to deepen this point, but we may have opportunity to spend some more words in the discussion. The pandemic, of course, cannot be ignored. Difficulties due to the lockdown measures can be easily imagined. Public events, meetings, even minor activities were cancelled down. What I like to underline here is that the participatory process of the deliberation about the plan continued, notwithstanding the lockdown procedures, mainly because public meetings already took place, and therefore the motivation to participate to the epidemiologic study was maintained. There was a continuous exchange with the local physicians, also members of extended peer community. One nice side product was the analysis of air pollution in the period pre-lockdown, during the lockdown, and after the lockdown. Citizen science sensors provided microdata with some interesting and unexpected results compared to the more trivial macro analysis we can find in the media. As shown in the slide, the pollution data in the period of March-May 2020 during the lockdown were similar to those monitored in the same period of the last year. But after end of lockdown, in the period of June-August 2020, they shows a marked reduction of pollutant concentration compared to the previous year. More specifically, there was no reduction according to the monitoring station close to the copper foundry in the lockdown period, but only after, pending the economic crisis. Thanks for the attention.
Now, I will open the discussion now, and I've seen some questions already. There was a question addressed to Muki, and Muki already replied with the indication where his papers can be found. Now, I have Roger Carles, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, and he has a question for, actually two questions for David. I see an additional problem with regards to the precautionary principle, other than the ones David mentioned, which we are seeing with the COVID, which is also related to your example of masks. A precautionary intervention can lead to iatrogenics even while trying to prevent a major catastrophe. I'm thinking about masks themselves, as we hear that misuse used by people with certain medical condition, etc., can cause harm itself, or the panic created in residence for the elderly. And there is a connected question. In all these cases, the precautionary principle seems insufficient, and a more sophisticated approach involving iatrogenics should also apply. Any thoughts on research done on the potential harm of the PP itself? Thank you. David.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can.
Good. Thank you. Yes, no, thank you very much. And very briefly, a great question. And I think, you know, I think I am sympathetic to the concerns that are raised. And I tried to say in my talk that I think broadly agree that the precautionary principle alone is not sufficiently prescriptive in any situation, and this one that's raised here about masks and in the current pandemic is one such example. I think that precaution can help lead us to deeper discussions that this community, this postnormal science community, is very interested in and very concerned about. What are the consequences of acting in error always must be considered when we call for action. And so I tried to suggest that precaution alone is not enough, but that it raises, I think, an educational opportunity for the public when you talk about what's precaution versus what's reaction, and get debates and discussions going in that. It highlights this challenge of acting in uncertainty. It doesn't guide us with certainty through that puzzle. So I think broadly I agree with the comment.
Okay, then we also have another question, and sorry, I lost just a second. Please forgive me. Yes, it's again for David, but of course the other can comment as well if they want to. And so we have plenty. So to David, is it just the public that needs this new concept of science, or also scientists themselves? Then I have Jerry Roberts, who says, here I would suggest a concept that Ariane Koenig has used in her transformative sustainability science, contingency. This is a corrective to the assumption that the real knowledge is uniform and universal. We expect that a face mask will keep out germs, and are surprised when all sorts of variations occur in the configuration mask phase. This obviously leads to craft personal tacit knowledge and the epistemology of extended peer community. Then there is another from Silvio, but I think with these two we have enough for the time being.
Maybe just I could just start with a comment to Zora about do scientists need a new concept? And I very much agree. I actually think in many ways the most important community that we in postnormal science should be speaking to are our scientific colleagues, particularly for me, I'm thinking of my colleagues in public health, for example, and environmental science, who I think too often would like to use they put on the armor or the weapons of being a good scientist. They put on the white coat in the hopes that that provides them some public legitimacy. And of course, I think that that's a mistake. And so, yes, indeed, I very much agree that the scientific community it needs to understand better postnormal science. And so I might just say one of my main concerns, I think, here, we need a better term, a new name, another name for postnormal science. Because when I try to talk to my scientist friends about postnormal science, I've immediately lost them. We need another name for it, I believe, because they get scared and they run away when I talk to them about postnormal science. They don't think that what they do is postnormal. So anyway, I very much agree with Zora. I'd like very much to talk with my science colleagues about a new understanding of what science does in areas like environmental health and COVID pandemics.
How about Jerry's comment? So you have who wants to say something? And there's another one. Wait, there are two. There is Silvia Fontovich. What are the lessons to the citizen science community? What are the lessons that can learn by your classification according to the PNS diagram? I think this is for Muki. And then we have Annibale for Gerard. Convincing evidence may be different for scientists than for citizens. Okay, just go ahead.
Yes.
Who goes first?
So in terms of the I'll go first. The classification, actually, it was interesting that the Gerard was presenting me with some clear examples of how things are being played out in different contexts of citizen science within the issue of air quality and so on, and also in the cases of CitieS-Health. So what we need to notice most is that there is a spectrum and different projects can sit in different places, and that's because it's both comfortable for the scientists and comfortable for the citizens. So I'll try again. I'm saying that the spectrum of topics that you can see the positioning of different projects and different activities across the different areas, that telling us that project can fit different places according to what scientists would want them. And of course, a lot of scientists would prefer to see citizen science at the bottom in a very clear tagged box doing very specific tasks, whereas we would like as a community to see it being pushed to the top. And the reason what we need to think is how we help the journey to start from the bottom and to move things towards the top.
Gerard, you want to answer Annibale?
Yeah, although I'm not sure what I have any very, very deep thinking. I mean, I agree with the statement that assessing how certain we are of a certain situation may be quite differently assessed by citizens and scientists. I think that argues for this approach that we've are exploiting now in the CitieS-Health project, where we actually co-create a project. I mean, at least in my view, both scientists and citizens should have a role in that. We noted in our trial, actually, that's not always difficult. No, sorry, that's not always easy to do that, and that sometimes citizens actually expect us to do the assessment for them. That was one experience. So we actually had, at least for several people, had to encourage them to challenge us on this. But in general, I agree with your statement.
I don't know if we have some extra time. I don't know if you can stay because, okay, we can, since we lost some time, if you can stay a bit longer. I have a couple of comments, actually. One is from Dorothy. That is, she said, it's true that many ignorant scientists think that PNS means you throw away science altogether. And this is a very real misinterpretation. PNS does not throw the baby science out with the bath water. This was a discussion was going on this morning after Jerry's presentation, of course, with intervention from Silvio. And indeed, we have a comment from Silvio as well. The same happened with Faye Rabens against method. Interpret as anything goes, which is not what he argued. And then I have the question from Gerard to Gerard. I'm sure that there are some occasions where models are better than monitoring. But the claim brings back memory of the what is this? Affair. I'm not sure what that is.
Yeah, I know that. That is a famous Dutch person who actually alerted the public to the fact that some of the models that were used in the National Institute of Public Health had very little basis in empirical work. So he called it basically a fantasy world. And that actually is a problem. I mean, when I referred to transparency, that's what I intended to say, that some of the people in the modeling community are actually quite removed from reality, and that, of course, is a big issue. But I don't think we should go to the, I mean, in citizen science, I think people may have sometimes too much expectations from monitoring at the expense of really well-developed models. And I really believe that some models are much better than some of the low-cost censoring that is done. And I think, as an expert, you should also not be afraid to say this.
Yeah, of course, I knew of the case, but I couldn't even pronounce the name. Sorry.
No.
Annibale, maybe you just ask a question. Why don't you give us some answers as well?
You're muted.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Just a comment on models with regard to real data. The management of the COVID pandemic is an example in which all is based on modeling, mostly mathematical modeling on infectious disease, while the real data are usually confusing and can lead to wrong decisions. So I think this is highly problematic.
I don't see any more questions from the stage, so I think we are, what time is it? It's 4:32, so I think at least here. So I think we can close the session, and I'm really grateful to you all, to all the people who asked questions or where they are silent but with us. Again, I'm very grateful to the digital people, and well, let's hope we can meet in person next year for PNS 6, be in Florence or wherever, but in a real place. Thanks, everyone, very much.
Okay.